Thank you for coming, and it's wonderful to be in Georgia. We've been trying to come here for a long time, and here we are. So you can see we decided to have a general theme about why location matters, why place matters, with three examples. Kristen is a political scientist, so she'll pose as a geographer for 15 minutes. And what we want to do is obviously just illustrate, give examples rather than get into depth in any one topic. So I've kind of prepared three ways that location matters, or that are typically examined when geographers, mostly some political scientists, look at place, space, context, location. When most people think about conflict and geography, they immediately think of territory. And clearly this is a very important subject about control of territory. But why is territory so important to people? Why do territorial conflicts seem to be almost irreconcilable? It's very difficult to resolve them. And it's obviously there is a large literature about territory for protection, but there's also a growing literature about control of territory for resources. And especially in places and times when resource scarcity is growing, then having control of these areas is absolutely central to a group's survival, as I'll show you for Kenya. Location, typically, it's not absolute location, it's relative location, so relative to something else. And Kristen will illustrate this to a large extent. Obviously, in terms of conflict studies, a lot of the point data, the location of conflicts, can be examined in a locational or spatial analytic framework, which is something that I've done for many years. The third one is a bit more difficult to summarize, but it's this idea that when you're explaining human behavior, when you're explaining political behavior, often political scientists and sociologists and other social scientists only examine the characteristics that people have to understand their behavior. But geographers, especially political geographers, argue that where you live also matters a lot. So that even if you have a really good model based on socio-demographic characteristics, it still doesn't account for why some places, for example, have a lot of conflict and places with similar kinds of peoples don't have conflict, right? So this difference between context is something that's of great interest to geographers. So we're interested in kind of the spatial variation, the geographic variation across a large region. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Kenya. And it's funny because here we have an Irish person talking about Kenya, a Norwegian talking about Ireland, and then another Irish American talking about the near abroad. So none of us are studying where we're from, which is a good thing. I mean, it's generally not a great idea to only focus on your home. But I have this large and ongoing research project for a few years. It's about conflict, and it's about this idea that climate change will increase conflict, especially in places that have few resources. And as those resources decline, let's say drought causing greater food scarcity, less pastures for animals, that kind of thing, there will be more conflict. So that it's almost an uncontroversial statement now to say that more climate change will cause more conflict. However, and this is the big caveat, the evidence doesn't show that. It's an easy relationship to make, but actually when you examine it, there's not very much evidence. So Kenya is a place where a lot of this research has occurred because it's a very diverse country in terms of ethnicities, in terms of ecological zones. It's also a country, frankly, that in sub-Saharan Africa that's easy to work in relative to some other places in West Africa and other places across the Sahel. So I'm just going to give you a little snippet of the kind of stuff that I've been doing in Kenya for the last few years. So this is the dominant school in the research and also in the policy debate. And it's called the Environmental Security School. And the argument is that climate change is leading to more conflict. And the argument is that grievances will increase and that people are likely to engage in struggles when climate change is generating or producing fewer resources. And the idea is, that groups can easily motivate, especially young men, to engage in violence because, in a sense, the alternatives are few and far between for them. So the opportunity costs are lowered, and therefore young men engage in more violence. There is an understanding that if you have a good institutional structure, if you have a fair governance, if you have a government with resources, you can reduce this incentive to violence. But in poor countries without these incentives, with bad governments, then you end up with more and more violence. So that's the kind of dominant view, and frankly, it's overstated. There's not a lot of evidence for it. I took a couple of headlines from newspapers, but actually this is one of the few scientific discussions that gets a lot of headlines. It's always in the news. And, but there's also, as these two headlines, one from Science magazine, the other from Spiegel, the German newspaper, will show that there's in fact quite a disagreement within the scientific community on this question. And I think this slide will illustrate what's going on. So this slide comes from a paper that I'm a co-author of. It's out in Nature in the next couple of weeks. And you can see on the left are the factors that are related to conflict based on the rankings and examinations of a group of so-called experts. But they are experts, I should say. People have studied conflict. You can see the rank ordered on the left from most important to least important. And you can see the top one is about economics, the second is about politics, the third is about political, social differences. But then the fourth and fifth are kind of path dependence in terms of geography and time. So if you live near an area that has conflict, you tend to get dragged into their conflicts. But if you look all the way down at the bottom, you see where the red arrow is pointing to climate variability and change, right? It's ranked very, very low in terms of importance. However, these experts were also asked to give an examination of what they thought was the uncertainty around these characteristics. And you can see the bar for uncertainty for climate change is very, very high. So what we're saying is that we have a very good sense of what causes conflicts and what places have conflicts, but we don't know how important climate change is. Up to now, it hasn't been very important, but we don't know what it's going to be like in the future. Okay? So this is an area of great and growing interest. A brief introduction to Kenya. Again, most of you know to the west is very wet. It's almost tropical rainforest near Lake Victoria, and then as the north and the east is drier and drier. And in terms of drought, the droughts are greater and more dramatic in the north and east. There's actually relatively little drought in the south and west. And Kenya has a lot of conflict as well. Literally hundreds of events, some pretty small scale events, people, a couple of people killed, not massive armies conflicting with each other, but militias organized along ethnic lines is the most common kind of conflict. And so the question, looking at this map, is how much of this is due to climate change and how much of it is due to political competition, ethnic hostilities, other non-climate factors. So that's the kind of question we're examining. The work is both field work, but also public opinion surveys. And if you do field work in Kenya, sometimes you get caught in this situation, right? So here's an outbreak of local violence in a town in northern Kenya where two groups are fighting, block the roads. You can see buildings burning in the background, the police standing around doing nothing, which is typical in Kenya. And yeah, it's again, small scale, but it's constant. And then the ethnic distributions in Kenya are amazingly diverse. No one dominant group, various political coalitions running the government, and then some groups in the north and east, pastoralists, to the south and west, farmers, and then mixed in the middle, and obviously a large urban population in Nairobi and a couple of other cities. So here's the kind of general livelihoods, pastoralism, livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, that sort of thing. Camels also in the northeast. And then in the west, farming in the south, kind of a mix. So the study, which is now going on for 5 or 6 years, is a combination of different kinds of data. First of all, very detailed climate records. So one of the things we're doing is examining the actual climate record at a very disaggregated scale, and also people's perception of how the climate is changing and matching them and see how accurate people are. And it turns out, not surprising I suppose, farmers are not as knowledgeable. They're not concerned about drought so much, because in fact for Western Kenya the problem is too much rainfall or too much heavy rainfall, and the seasonality is very important for them. In the north and east it's about drought, it's about scarcity of pasture land, and people are very aware of even small variations in climate. Urban residents less so obviously than farmers or pastoralists. So we have climate records, we also have detailed satellite imagery, we have very large public opinion surveys, two huge surveys in 2014 and then last summer, in the same places, not a panel, but in exactly the same places with the same questions, looking at the changes over a 4-year period. We have obviously all of the geolocated data about violent events. We have lots of interviews that we did in various counties around Kenya, and then as I said, repeating it in 2018. So again, these are just the sample points across Kenya. It's a representative nationally. It's also representative of the major populations. Again, it's 140 questions, 6 experimental questions for those of you who this makes any difference. And again, in Kenya, what's really important in this kind of work is matching ethnicities, interviewer and respondent, and also genders, women with women, men with men. So, I mean, here's just an example of people who report more drought. This is the interviews from 2014, and again, not terribly surprising, most of the area in the west is lower ratios of reporting drought than places in the north and east. Overall though, if you look at Kenya as a whole, it's 58% of Kenyans believe there have been more droughts in the past decade. But if you look at the lines for the pastoralist groups, and they're listed on the bottom here, Maasai, Samburu, Pokot, Turkana, Borana, those ratios, those high bars are close to 100%, right? So they're the populations in the north and east who are most exposed and frankly most vulnerable to the effects of drought on their livelihood, which is based around livestock. And again, the same thing for food security. Generally, pastoralists, the red bars on the left, you can see have higher ratios of food shortages on a daily basis, or sometimes probably every week, whereas crop farmers and urban residents and so on have less so. So there's a real difference between pastoralists and the other populations in Kenya. And then this is a kind of an interesting experiment, or an interesting project. Most people who study conflict as it has happened. In other words, they examine conflict events in a geographic way, but they don't really test or examine very carefully the propensity, the probability, the likelihood that people will engage in violence. So this question is used in the Afrobarometer all across sub-Saharan Africa. It's been repeated many, many times. And it basically says, which group do you feel closest to? Group 1, who use violence, is never justified. And then 2, sometimes it's justified, right? So we repeated that question in Kenya, and you can see here's the average data, but you can see about 20% of the respondents, 20.6% support violence. In other words, they are group 2 rather than group 1. But also we have other data, and if you see this one at the bottom, which is underlined, says attacked within 1 year. So 17% of the respondents, either they or their families, have been attacked in the previous year. So there's a lot of violence in this country. But then, and here's the interesting thing, if this is the case, the Environmental Security School would say that people who have had crop failures, people who have food shortages, they should be more likely to support violence. But in fact, as these coefficients show at the top, they're not, they don't. And again, this is a interactive term with the treatment effect in an experimental way. We have some, as I said, experimental questions. Many of the other things make sense. So in other words, pastoralists are more likely to support violence if you look at some of the variables in the box and the statistics significance. What we did find, and this is kind of important, is there any way, is there any other explanation other than the kind of environmental security argument about violence? And the answer actually has to do with informal governance. So if you live in an area which has traditional rules for distributing resources, typically tribal elders get together, they work out how many animals should go to various water holes, how much pasture is available, this sort of thing. If you have traditional rules and that they're operating well, that actually reduces violence significantly, which is shown in this underline bar here. Right, so we ask people about governance, formal governance, informal government, and it matters. So I'll just show you the last slide here. So here's our summary. There's no evidence that people who have greater shortages are more likely to support the use of violence, and we've seen this consistently. We also see that if you have traditional rules, governance that works, even though it's informal, that reduces the possibility for violence. And then the last one has to do with there's no relationship to the distribution of rainfall over time. So again, this is just a snippet for Kenya. We're continuing this work. We're now doing a large cell phone survey, a repeated cell phone survey with panels in northern Kenya, and that's going to take the next 5 years or so. So thank you very much.
So thank you so much for inviting me to us to come and give this talk. I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Jana talked about: informal institutions, place and space. Even though I'm a political scientist who cares a lot about place and space. This is work that is co-authored with Kit Rickard, who is a PhD candidate in political science at University College London. So very often when I say that we did something, particularly when we made nice maps and did some of the analysis, that is all thanks to Kit. So the title is Legacies of Wartime Order, Punishment, Attacks and Social Control in Northern Ireland. And the conflict in Northern Ireland came to an end 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, and this is often hailed as a peace agreement that is a relatively successful peace agreement. There has been no major outbreak of violence between the groups that were fighting one another during the conflict. It's a peace process. When you look at survey data, that is overall well received. Tons of money has been poured into this peace process. So it's a piece of, it's a post-conflict society that we would think would function quite well. Now, one of the puzzling things about Northern Ireland is represented in these newspaper articles here. These are about so-called punishment attacks. And punishment attacks are attacks by paramilitary groups today, or people acting in the name of paramilitary groups, who are seeking to control their own community. So they're trying to police their own community, attacking civilians within their own communities. So the first one here from Londonderry or Derry is a shooting attack, and the other one was a sledgehammer attack. And this is a paramilitary group trying to act as police and punishing people for a variety of crimes that they're doing within their own community. And there's a repertoire of punishment here. Some of them on the sort of lower end, there might be giving warnings that you should not be doing these sorts of things. Then you might be beaten up, then you might be shot, then you might be expulsed from your community, and you might be killed. And the most infamous or famous of these are kneecapping, so shooting people in the kneecaps as a punishment, or if it's a severe crime, it might be a six-pack, so you're shot in the ankles, elbows, knees. And these might be clean or dirty, depending on how severe the crime was. But there's a system here of punishment. The same system of punishment in formal justice went on during the Troubles, but it's happening today. Now, we've gotten the police in Northern Ireland to give us their geolocated data of where these attacks have happened in the entire post-Good Friday period. And what's remarkable here is how persistent it is. And it's perhaps not so surprising that in the immediate post-conflict period you see quite a few of these attacks. But what is more remarkable is that you're seeing in the last 10 years or so, you're seeing the persistence of these attacks happening in a society where we really wouldn't think that paramilitary groups would still be operating. And that's what we're interested in this paper, explaining, well, why are these attacks happening? Why are they happening? Where they're happening? And if these are attempts by paramilitary groups to exercise social control within their communities, does it work in the sense that people think these are effective at establishing social control? So those are the research questions we're examining in this paper. PSNI up here on the photo is the police service of Northern Ireland. So how are paramilitary groups able to do so, to try to exercise this kind of social control? You know, why do they do it? Where they do it? And do armed groups today exercise social control to the detriment of the state's authority? And of course, the state has undergone a number of reform attempts in Northern Ireland, as in many post-conflict societies. Particularly, there's been significant attempts at police reform. The police was a very contentious actor during the conflict, seen as being on the side or by the Catholic or Catholic nationalist Republican community, seeing it, you know, being seen as one of the key perpetrators of violence. So there's been a number of efforts at reforming the police, and some of these groups are trying to undermine the authority of the state, particularly the police. So the literature we build on to try to figure out, you know, what's going on here is a mix of political science and geography literature. There's a growing body of work in political science and conflict studies that focus on how armed groups during times of conflict do a lot more than just wage war. They also govern. The first citation here is to McCall, who is a political geographer who wrote about insurgent states in 1969. But then this is a research program that really has been picked up in political science in the last few years. And it focuses on how armed groups do a range of governance functions. At the minimum, they provide policing, they might provide schooling, hospital services, do sort of state-like functions in wartime. And they do this for a variety of reasons. It helps solidify group strength and territorial control. It provides legitimacy both internally to their own communities, but also externally to other actors internationally. It might strengthen recruitment, support, prevent defection. So there's a range of reasons why they do it in wartime. What we argue in this paper is that this kind of wartime social control, these informal institutions that develop during armed conflicts, are really hard to dislodge. And they're hard to dislodge for two main reasons. There's a bottom-up mechanism in the sense that civilians might come to rely on these informal sources of authority within their own communities for their sort of everyday strategies of survival, right? So if you have a problem of antisocial behavior or car theft in community, you get used to calling up your armed group, your local paramilitary group, rather than the police. There's also a top-down mechanism for why these practices might persist and persist for a long time into the post-war period, and that has to do with the incentives of armed groups. So armed groups might get accustomed to positions of power. Strategically, they may have political reasons to want to control certain areas, and operational reasons too. And these reasons might be, the political reasons might be that they simply want to delegitimize the state. They want to show long after the conflict comes to an end that, you know, the state can't control certain areas. They also might have more operational reasons that are not so political, in the sense that they might be engaged in criminal activities. And you know, if you're going to engage in criminal activities, it helps that you control certain areas. And what are the areas that you're going to seek to control? Maybe the areas where your predecessors used to control, the areas that your predecessors would control during the conflict itself. So this gives us two expectations that we're exploring in this study. So by trying to exercise social control in areas where their armed groups were historically rooted, spoilers, so groups that want to spoil the peace process, are better able to mobilize, recruit, and control information. So we would expect that post-war armed groups are more likely to seek control areas where there were well-developed informal institutions during the war. So there should be a geographic pattern here over time in areas they controlled during the conflict and after the conflict. And I'll show you how we're testing that in a minute. Now, of course, armed groups that are trying to exercise social control in a post-war period anywhere, they're not doing that in a vacuum. They're doing that in competition with, certainly with the state that is trying to become the legitimate upholder of law and order. And in particular in post-war societies where the state has undergone and is undergoing a series of reforms. So it is not a given that the the attempts of these armed groups at exercising social control is actually successful or effective. So what we want to explore is whether they are effective. So post-war, if armed groups are effective at establishing social control, residents in areas they seek to control are going to be more likely to turn to informal rather than formal authorities if they have a law and order problem. So those are the two things we want to examine in this project. And we do so through a variety of means. We rely on a history of wartime order and social control in Northern Ireland, primarily to figure out what kind of social control did the Republican and the Loyalist groups develop. Both of them developed these informal justice systems where they were policing within their own communities. And it might be surprising that Loyalist groups that were ostensibly on the side of the British state were developing informal institutions, but also in Loyalist-controlled areas during the Troubles, the police from 1969 onwards was more or less absent. So if you had a problem, you couldn't necessarily call up the police. So also there you saw paramilitary groups taking on sort of a rudimentary law and order or justice, develop a rudimentary justice system. We rely on in-depth interviews with stakeholders. We also then map out where the areas where paramilitary groups exercise social controls during the Troubles, and today relying on two sources of data: in-group killings from the Troubles that is geolocated, and then the Police Service of Northern Ireland's geolocated data of where we're seeing these paramilitary style attacks today. And then we pair this data with survey data to see if people who live in areas that are controlled by paramilitary groups today see formal versus informal sources of authority as effective. So let me show you some of that evidence. So the first thing we want to then test is there this geographic persistency over time, right? From the conflict to the post-war period. And I'm just going to show you a couple of the maps of Belfast here. So the first map here on your this map here is paramilitary, it's in-group Catholic deaths during the Troubles. And it shows you Belfast, it shows you areas where you saw a high number of in-group Catholic deaths during the Troubles. So these are areas that the Republican paramilitary groups were trying to control during the Troubles. The other map shows you what happens in the post-war period, particularly in the last 10 years. And you see, there's some overlap here in areas, or quite a lot of overlap, in areas where you had Republican paramilitary groups exercising informal justice during the Troubles, and where they're doing it today. Similar pattern you see when you look at Loyalist groups. So again, you see the pattern during the Troubles, the areas that saw most or the highest level of social control during the conflict itself, and then you're seeing on the second map the areas where Loyalist paramilitary groups today are trying to exercise social control by engaging in punishment attacks, paramilitary style attacks. So we've done this for Northern Ireland as a whole. Another way to look at this is to look at the proportion of attacks that happen in areas that experienced these in-group killings, these informal justice systems during the Troubles. The gray bars here shows you the trend for all attacks, the green ones for Republican groups, and the orange for Loyalist groups. Now the pattern here is the strongest for the Republican groups, so the groups that were fighting against the state. So they are the ones that are clearly drawing most on the legacy of wartime social control into the post-war period. And these dynamics, so we also did a lot of interviews, are highlighted or sort of reinforced in some of the interviews we did. So people would talk about, bottom up, there's this folk memory of going to paramilitary groups within certain communities. You just do not go to the police if there's car theft in your community, antisocial behavior. You simply don't go to the police. You call up the local paramilitary, your local paramilitary guy, and it is mostly a guy. So there's this expectation formed through years of swift and speedy justice of paramilitary groups. Top down, of course, you also have incentives for armed groups, paramilitary groups today, or people acting in the name of paramilitary groups today, of either wanting to delegitimize the state or simply wanting to control certain communities for criminal gains. So that's it. So there's some evidence of this pattern then over time. Now, the question then is, does it work in the sense that these groups are clearly trying to control certain communities long after the conflict came to an end? But it doesn't take that many people for this attempt to be there, right? You have this top-down mechanism, you have a few people in some communities calling up the, the paramilitary groups if there are, antisocial behavior happening, but what about the population in general? And this is a poster from Belfast. There's a big public campaign now against these paramilitary style attacks and, trying to tell people that, these guys are not really protecting you. Now, in order for us to try to then establish, if armed groups are effective at establishing social control, residents in areas they seek to control are more likely to turn to informal rather than formal sources of authority when they have a law and order problem, we rely on a public opinion survey. And so I was part of a project where we did 3 big public opinion surveys in 2016 on attitudes for peace. We asked people a range of questions about the peace process in Guatemala, Nepal, and Northern Ireland. This is just from Northern Ireland that I draw on here. Nationally representative sample. And so a range of questions about the peace process, various sources of authority, people's experiences of violence. And then what we're interested in is one particular question here, which is an antisocial behavior scenario. So we want to assess the effectiveness of formal versus informal sources of authority within a community. So we gave people this scenario. A man lives in a neighborhood where there's severe problem of antisocial behavior, such as vandalism and car thefts. And antisocial behavior is a big problem. It's a term that is used very frequently across all of the United Kingdom about sort of car thefts or youths that are stealing bikes in your area. These are sort of everyday forms of crimes. So the question is, what would he do? And we gave the respondents a variety of authorities they could go to. And the 2 we are most interested in is the police, which would be the formal source of authority, and then they would rank that on a scale that it would help, it would make no difference, help a little or help a lot in solving this problem. And then we also asked them a range of questions that would get at informal authorities. The one we're interested in here is contact a member of the community who has influence. We couldn't ask people directly, would you call up a paramilitary group, because it became clear that no one would necessarily answer that question. So through the trials or the pilots and pre-tests of the survey, this was the best question we would, the question that would most closely capture, going to an informal source of authority in the community. And we then created a dichotomous variable for whether each respondent rates informal institutions, so going to a person in the community who has influence, as more effective than going to the police when it comes to this particular scenario here. And then we run a regression model where we control for a range of other things, of course, that would affect how people view various sources of authority. But the one thing we're most interested in exploring is, does it make a difference if people are living in an area where you're seeing a lot of paramilitary style attacks today? Because these are areas that the paramilitary groups are trying to control, but does it work in the sense that people will turn to informal sources of authority at the detriment of the state's authority? And the evidence is mixed here. So the first figure shows you what happens when we look at all paramilitary style attacks. So we don't distinguish between the groups. The second shows you what happens when we look at loyalist groups only, and the final one when we look at Republican groups only. And you can't actually see the confidence interval so well on the figure on the screen here. But in all of them, you see, for all of them, there's a slight upwards curve. So the more paramilitary style attacks there are in your area, there's a slight upwards trend in you rating informal sources of authority as effective. But the confidence intervals there are really wide, so we can't say very much. For Republican groups, it's barely going upwards, and the confidence intervals go in both directions, so we can't say very much there. For the loyalist groups, that's where we see a clearest trend. So if you are living in an area where there are quite a few paramilitary style attacks in your local area, you are more likely to think that informal authorities are more effective than formal authorities. So, what does this all mean? Legacies of wartime institutions in Northern Ireland remain. They're fueled by decades of socialization. They're used by armed groups for criminal and political aims. The pattern, when you just look at the geographic pattern, is most persistent for the Republican groups, the groups that were fighting the states. They're the ones who are most likely to draw on this legacy of we used to control certain areas. These are the areas we're now going to try to control after the conflict had come to an end. And this is a challenge for the formal authorities of the state. We spoke to the police, the paramilitary task force there, and they talk about how there are certain communities that we simply don't control. We can barely enter certain communities still, 30 years on. But there is mixed evidence from our study that in general, people within the areas of paramilitary groups' control find informal authorities more effective than the police. The evidence, there's more evidence that that's the case for loyalist paramilitary groups than for Republican paramilitary groups. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. That was a slightly puzzling finding for us when we were doing the study. But that's where we are so far. The next step in our research is to do another survey in Northern Ireland that will target these communities that paramilitary groups are controlling, and to get a bigger sample of respondents within these communities and match them to areas that on all sorts of socio-demographic indicators are similar but do not see attacks happening, to get even more respondents who live within these areas of control. But thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to state how delighted I am to be here to present this research to you. I have studied Georgia a long time, and it's the first time that I am here in Tbilisi State University presenting the research which has been conducted with Dr. John O'Loughlin for well over a decade. And I am very grateful to Dr. Georgi Godsadze for his long-term friendship and support for us, and to other Georgian officials and individuals who have supported this particular research down the years. So I want to talk about this book, which came out in 2017, which, as you probably can see from the cover, has a certain Georgian flavor to it from the outset, since this is a photograph which was taken on the administrative boundary line in South Ossetia, or between South Ossetia or the Skin Valley region and Georgia proper, or uncontested Georgia. The terminology, of course, is always very saturated with meaning, and the very term near abroad, of course, is one that is part of that. I used that as an expression, as the title of the book, in part because the publisher told me to, but it also was a particular phrase which got at the geographic dimensions of it, of the particular geopolitical struggles that I am addressing in this book. I want to say that this does not endorse the particular meaning that is sometimes given to that phrase, which is that this is a Russian conception of the former Soviet Union, in which the Soviet Union looks at those states that were Russia looks at the states that were previously part of the Soviet Union and does not see them as sufficiently, as fully sovereign, and retains a right of intervention, a right to shape the particular futures of these countries. That is the sort of so-called sphere of privileged interests. I am problematizing that. In other words, I'm making that a question. That's a subject of investigation. I'm not endorsing that particular vision. So the book has a theoretical foundation. It is not one that is very to the fore. I'm happy to talk about that theoretical foundation in questions and answers, but most people are very interested in simply the empirics and on the story that it tells. But just very briefly on the theoretical dimensions. It focuses first of all on the geopolitical field, which I think can be characterized in a certain abstract way. What is happening in Russia and the borderland states of it in the former, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the process of post-colonial development is one that has happened in other locations too, and so we can make certain comparisons and make certain generalizations about it. We also need to address the particular cultures that are at work, and there's a series of these, and I pay particular attention to these in the book. We're focus on narratives, a focus on sort of affective commitments to a place, how certain territories are seen as sacred and sort of beyond negotiation, beyond deliberation. And it's of course wonderful to have this particular backdrop which sort of illustrates the tie between sacredness and territory, which is something that political geographers examine and is one of the reasons why we see a lot of conflict around the world having a territorial dimension. The last aspect is a geopolitical condition. It's not something that I spend a lot of time on in the book, but is actually quite significant, and that has to do with the technological developments and forms of communication and transportation which shape our sense of connectedness. This goes back to traditional geopolitics and the idea of spatial revolution, that certain technologies create a spatial revolution in how places are connected. So this is the abstracted conception of the so-called near abroad, where you have the Russian Federation, and then you have states like Georgia, like Ukraine, like Moldova, and others seeking to reconstitute themselves around a different national idea from that of the Soviet Union, and go back to the past and to sort of redefine what the nation state is going to be all about. And of course that's a very contested issue, because being part of the Soviet Union and the sort of fire of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, created a particular community of suffering, which the former Soviet space is still dealing with, and a very fraught legacy of that. And it is this, we saw that in Victory Day in Ukraine, where we came from a few days ago, and I'm sure it's the same here, where you have that very mixed legacy, which is highly emotive for a lot of people because of the horrors of that particular time. So we have a nationalizing state, and in many instances you have a particular region within the nationalizing state which still retains strong ties to the metropolitan state. Now, Kristen talked about Northern Ireland. This particular model applies to Northern Ireland. You can see the nationalizing state as the island of Ireland, for example, the metropolitan state being Great Britain or the United Kingdom. You had the Irish Revolt against that in 1916, and then you had the partition of the country, and so you have a secessionist region that wants to break from the nationalizing project, in the case of Ireland, making a Gaelic Ireland in opposition to the British Empire, and Ulster or Northern Ireland seceding from that and retaining very strong ties to the metropolitan state. But of course you have similar sort of forms of spatial connection across former Soviet space. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. And then you also have, and this is building upon the work of Rogers Brubaker, where he talks about a triadic nexus. I've added two other elements to it. You have an external normative power, in this case the European Union or the United States, seeking to provide help to allow the nationalizing states realize a different future for themselves. But this being seen by the metropolitan state as competitive behavior, as encroachment upon their traditional sphere of influence, that sort of spatial ambivalent attitude where the states are seen as still very, very close, and there's still a sort of privileged attitude towards them. And then you have within the metropolitan state itself a secessionist region. And in this case it is Chechnya, but in other cases it would be particular fears of immigrant communities within the metropolitan state that could potentially rebel. The British state, of course, had a lot of problems with terrorism within Britain coming from communities, some Irish communities and other people that would be part of sort of terrorist organizations going in and causing havoc within the metropolitan state. France also had a similar attitude or similar sets of issues. Okay, so let's talk then about what is very familiar to you, which is the particular sort of fragmented territorial landscape. And so what Dr. O'Loughlin and I have studied, and also Dr. Bakke has studied this too, is the emergence of what are called de facto states in the literature. These are essentially breakaway territories which have proclaimed themselves as independent states and have sought to acquire recognition from the international community from their particular status. Of course, this in part is a product of what happened in the 1990s, but then you had the situation being transformed by the events of 2008, and then again transformed by the 2014. So the book Near Abroad is in part a story of two invasions. It's the story of the invasion of Georgia in 2008, and then the story of the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And so what I do is look at these sort of clashing, the sort of geopolitical clash between Euro-Atlantic expansionism and the revanchism of the Russian state, clashing narratives of identity, victim and belonging, and then the issues of hybrid warfare and information warfare. So that is what, that's the kind of larger context for the book. What I wanted to draw your attention to is that one of the contributions that we have sought to make is to try to do research in the de facto states themselves. So Dr. O'Loughlin and I did research in 2010 and then 2014, where we were able to, with the help of the Levada Center, which is an independent, non-Kremlin related survey firm in Russia, to do research in these very contested areas and actually be able to get a sense of public opinion in these areas. We also did research in 2014, December 2014, where we included a contested area of southeast Ukraine as well as Crimea. We wrote a series of articles on Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which dealt with the attitudes there. This is a particular slide from, which deals with our findings from a publication called Questioning Post-Soviet. This is a Wilson Center publication. If you Google this, you can access this. It's free to download as a PDF. What I want to underscore is that in the 2 rounds of surveys that we did in these places, the key defining feature of 3 of the 4 de facto states is great regret at the collapse of the Soviet Union. So these are places where there's a lot of, the phrase nostalgia is often used to describe the Soviet Union, but these are places that have sort of been devastated by the changes since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there's, when we ask the question, was it a right step or wrong step, you can see the particular survey results here. The one exception to that is really Karabakh. People in the Karabakh do not have nostalgia for the collapse of the Soviet Union, because in part they saw the Soviet Union as preventing their independence, preventing them joining with Armenia, with Soviet Armenia. And as you well know, the whole history of the Karabakh conflict is that really was the spark that then spread elsewhere, because a lot of those conflicts began before the collapse in 1988. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then we asked about attitudes towards future status in the de facto states, and we asked this in 2010 and 2011, and we broke it down by ethnicity. So the first set of slides here is Abkhaz, Armenians, Georgians, and Russians, and the particular attitudes in Abkhazia. As you can see, the idea of unity with the patron, their patron being the geopolitical sponsor, in this case Russia, the Russian Federation. You can see that amongst Armenians and amongst Russians in Abkhazia, they want to join Russia. They don't not necessarily want an independent Abkhazia as it's constituted, as the Abkhaz state claims to have this aspiration for independence, whereas the Abkhaz themselves are much more supportive of that particular project. Now, Abkhazia is an ethnocratic state, and there you can see in plain material terms the appeal that has to one particular ethnicity within Abkhazia. South Ossetia is a different situation. Skan Valley region, it's one that, of course, you are very, very familiar with, simply to underscore the fact that the idea of South Ossetia being an independent state doesn't even have support within South Ossetia, because the majority of the very small population that lives there, estimated 32 to 50,000 people depending on who you ask, separate from the Russian forces that are also there. They want to join North Ossetia. There's a lot of connection between South Ossetia and North Ossetia through the Rocky Tunnel, so therefore that's the particular aspiration there. The case in Moldova is more complicated, and I will address that at the end, because this is a particular attitudes from 2010, 2011. I want to show you a slide at the end about attitudes in 2014. Now, let me briefly address the case of, to show you the kind of importance of location, but also failure of geopolitical entrepreneurship on the part of the Russian state. As you know, the Russian state took over Crimea with the little green man celebrated in this famous statue in Simferopol. But I want to talk about Novorossiya, because Novorossiya was a particular geopolitical project that was sponsored by certain nationalist groups and had the support of the Kremlin for a few months. And it was next to Russia. This was a territory that some within the Kremlin felt was, you know, ripe for plucking, and the conception was that Ukraine was not really a state, and so therefore this could happen. Well, what of course did occur is that this project failed, and it failed quite significantly. And we were able to show the differences through analysis, through survey research as to why it failed. So first of all, you will remember that the Kremlin's conception of Euromaidan was that it was a fascist coup. even though Ukraine today has an incoming Jewish president, has a current prime minister that is Jewish. But nevertheless, that was the particular conception was promoted by the Kremlin, and I don't need to tell you too much about that. What we did is that's a narrative that's out there. We asked people, is that true or not? As you can see, quite a significant difference between people in southeast Ukraine. This is the so-called contested area of Ukraine and Crimea. So people in Crimea bought into that narrative. Now, I should underscore, by the time of December 2014, the media in Crimea was fully controlled by the Kremlin. They shut down independent media, they shut down Tatar television stations and the like. So they brought that territory within their infosphere. Whereas within Ukraine, Russian media was banned, and therefore you had a different narrative. Now, having said that, I don't think that just we should assume that media in and of itself and the messages people get is determinative. I think this has to do with identity, and I think this has to do with a massive miscalculation on the part of Russian nationalists who are sponsoring this sort of greater Russia as to the popular support of Novorossiya. We asked attitudes towards Novorossiya. What is Novorossiya? And we give them people in southeast Ukraine and also in Crimea, we give them a very binary question. You know, so Novorossiya is Russian political technology designed to destroy Ukraine. Or is it the self-expression of the Ukrainian people, their aspiration for self-determination? So in other words, what the Kremlin would say, as opposed to what Ukraine would say. As you can see, the vast majority of people in southeast Ukraine reject the Kremlin conception of Novorossiya. That's the dark lines there. You also have the difficult to say is the sort of the particular hatched part of the bar. Contrast that to Crimea, where there's overwhelming support for the Kremlin's conception of what Novorossiya is, except among the Tatar population that we were able to include in our sample. Whereas you can see there's quite a significant dissatisfaction with the Kremlin understanding of it, and a defection from that particular narrative. Finally, I want to sort of end on this particular diagram, which is part of the goal of Near Abroad was to provide a thick understanding of geopolitics. Too often, when you say the word geopolitics, people think, well, it's great powers competing with each other. And of course that is true. But what I wanted to do in the book, and I think what our research is trying to do, is to show the attitudes of people and to give a much thicker understanding. Real people, different places with different understandings and real dilemmas over territory and the emotions associated with that. So in this case, this is the the results of the survey in 2014, December 2014. The 2013 refers to Karabakh and a survey that Dr. Bakke did there. And it is it underscores, the red is identification with your patron. As you can see, people in Karabakh are divided as to whether it should be an independent state or whether they should unify with Armenia. In Transnistria, in December of 2014, the overwhelming majority of sentiment was to join the Russian Federation. They wanted to be part of Crimea. They wanted to be like Crimea. They wanted to be sort of gathered up as a sort of a territory which was going to be an exclave. It's not touching on Russia, but they wanted to be gathered up. That was the sentiment there. Similarly with Ossetians, in Abkhazia, much more complex situation, which is one that, of course, remains to this day. So that's a sort of brief overview of some of the themes in this book, and I'm happy to kind of entertain questions, as I'm sure are others. Okay, thank you very much.